This is TWiT.
We have some serious news coming out of Germany and New York. Germany's Spiegel Online and the New York Times reported that the NSA had successfully hacked North Korea's internet as early as 2010. They did it by placing malware able to track the computers used by the 6,000 or so North Korean government hackers in a unit called Bureau 121. And this is really interesting, Lindsay, in light of the fact that when the Sony hack happened, the federal government seemed pretty sure that it was North Korea. The evidence kind of pointed to North Korea, mostly didn't point to North Korea, but the FBI and other U.S. government agencies no, it's definitely North Korea. And apparently they knew that because they had been paying attention and hacking and tracking the hackers that work for the North Korean government since 2010. It's really kind of a fascinating story. Is there anyone they don't hack? It's really kind of impressive.
It is. And, you know, what's interesting to me about this story is it was given to a couple of outlets. The New York Times wrote a piece that reads very much like, here's what the U.S. government wants you to know about what it knew. Here's what it's actually working on. Here's why we didn't catch it. They say that the North Koreans basically created a spear phishing attack. Sort of they used and they got the network credentials for a Sony system admin. And, you know, you got to think that system admin was a pretty smart person who doesn't just give away credentials. So these North Korean hackers were really smart, but the U.S. government, despite all of this surveillance, essentially didn't catch it. They didn't notice how bad it was, even though they knew the North Koreans had penetrated Sony's network.
I have the feeling that the reason they didn't know was that the North Korean hackers, I mean, after all, we're talking about 6,000 individual human beings full-time hacking targets around the world. Mostly that's going to be South Korean and U.S. targets, I would imagine, the primary rivals of North Korea. And, you know, they're in there messing around, mucking about in all kinds of servers, I'm sure. And I'm sure that the U.S. government was probably more concerned about Pentagon computers and other things and probably didn't take the penetration of a movie studio all that seriously. And weren't really paying attention. Again, that's just guesswork on my part. I really have no idea why they missed this thing. What's interesting about this as well is we learn more about how the North Korean internet works. They basically use Chinese networks that connect North Korea. In other words, North Korea goes through China, and so the U.S. sort of hacked the connection between North Korea and the internet, which takes place in China. So they were essentially hacking China to monitor the North Koreans. And they picked through connections in Malaysia that are favored by North Korean hackers, and they penetrated directly into the north with the help of South Korea and other American allies. So there are others involved in this. This wasn't just a sort of N.S.A. effort. This was a international effort to hack North Korea. Very fascinating. And you know, there's all kinds of details about this coming out of Spiegel Online and New York Times, including the fact that the U.S. implanted what they called beacons that automatically went in there and mapped the computer networks and surveillance software, and they even had destructive malware in there. So they presumably had the ability to do something like Stuxnet at some point, somewhere, if the opportunity presented itself, which it may not have done. And my big question now, though, Lindsay Turrentine, is what happens now? Is this whole thing, is their cover blown? Has the U.S. been found out and stopped from now hacking? In other words, has the revelation of these stories essentially taken North Korea off the table for the N.S.A.?
I'm going to assume, and this is again just an assumption, that because this network of beacons was established around 2010, the U.S. felt safe explaining what it did because it's probably working on something else already. That's my guess, and that they waited a little bit to make sure that they can keep on doing what they're doing, even if this gets shut down. But the other interesting thing about it to me is that, like you said, this is running through China. So presumably China knows that the North Koreans are using its infrastructure to do this. And what's its motivation? Does this mean that everything North Korea is ferreting out, China knows? I would assume so. That's the advantage that China gets allowing this to happen. So I'm sure the U.S. kind of wants China to know, hey, we know what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, China and North Korea have a weird relationship. They're basically, China's the closest thing that North Korea has to an ally, and yet China's kind of like looks at North Koreans like, don't mess things up for us. Just stay in your cage. They even have, recently the Chinese are deploying huge militias to patrol the North Korean border, and mostly to keep out defectors who are just streaming across into China. but it's I'm sure that China has its hands full protecting itself from North Korean hackers, and they're probably less concerned about North Korea hacking the United States.